Roman Travers, Magic Talk.
His glass is always topped up and overflowing. He's ever the optimist. It's Harold Hillman, our leadership coach. Good morning.
Good morning, Roman.
Sheepers, you make me feel lazy. You're training for marathons. You're writing books. You probably play the trumpet too, do you?
No, I was never good at. I tried to play the piano.
Oh, I love piano.
A good friend of mine is a violinist. I even tried that back. I think if you don't start as a child, it's probably difficult to play an instrument, learn an instrument as an adult. And so I'm not intuitive. I'm not intuitive enough when I sit down and try to play the piano. It's always sort of what's on the page, as opposed to I think a real musician probably allows a fair blend of feeling or intuition, impact.
Yeah. You know what you just did, though? You just said, I'm probably not, I probably can't. We always do that. That lack of optimism that we have for ourselves sometimes. Let other people put you down, but we do it to ourselves so easily, don't we?
That's right. You caught me.
I know.
Absolutely there. Look, there's a lot of research now that really shows that it does pay to be an optimist. And that proverbial question, do you see the glass as half empty or half full? It makes a big difference in the quality of one's life, but particularly if you're a leader. If you see the glass half full, that really speaks to the realm of what's possible. And when you talk with people about what's possible, even around an obstacle, let's say that we are trying to get from point A to point B, and you have two people sort of staring at an obstacle that sits there in the middle. An optimist is more likely to think about what's possible. What can we do here to navigate around or through that obstacle? As opposed to a pessimist who is likely to think more in terms of what's probable. An optimist thinks in terms of what's possible. So the energy tends to be upward and outward.
Is there only optimism and pessimism? What about realism?
Realism sits right there in the middle.
That's what I say to people when they say, you're so negative. I say, actually, I'm being realistic. I cannot run an ultra marathon. That's not being pessimistic. It's being realistic.
Yeah, realism sits there in the middle. So if you think about a continuum with optimism on one end and pessimism on the other end, there is something disconnecting about anyone who sits at the extreme end. So an extreme optimist sometimes projects the notion that they don't live in our world. In our real world, are you delusional? Sometimes people can be so positive to the point where it is disconnecting, because it's sort of like, are you aware of what we're facing into right now? And then at the other end of the continuum, at the extreme end of pessimism, there's a lot of negativity. It's not necessarily intentional, but it's a person who, before they even start, they talk themselves and sometimes the team out of being able to push into something.
Yeah.
To your point, realism does sit right there in the middle, and that is what some people would call, let's be practical around this. Let's not be overly optimistic to the point where this is just ridiculous in terms of what we think we can do here. But let's also not be overly pessimistic to the point where we don't even allow ourselves to start.
Yeah. You know those people, and there'll be someone who springs to mind as soon as I say this. That person, what a beautiful day. Oh, no, I heard it's going to rain.
Yes.
Oh, you've done so well this year. No, I'm saving up because I'm probably going to get cancer and die next week. So do you have a choice as to whether you are an optimist or a pessimist?
You do. There is a book called Learned Optimism written by Marty Seligman. Oh, the book is probably about 15 years old now, but Marty Seligman, who used to study depression and used to be an expert around learned helplessness, then really began to focus on the power of optimism. There's so many benefits associated with it. It starts early in life. So the research suggests that by the age of 6 or 7, you can typically tell whether a child is an optimist or a pessimist just based on the energy that they project. Some kids perhaps being a little bit more in terms of what I call the internal critic or the inner critic or the inner coach. It's that voice in your head that says, go ahead, push through this. What's the worst that can happen? Do it. That's the inner coach. And the inner critic is, maybe you shouldn't. You're going to mess up. It's not going to look good. And so by the age of 6 or 7, it's real clear that kids, you can often tell whether a kid is going to have huge self-confidence in terms of backing themselves, or low self-confidence where they tend not to push into too much risk.
Well, I grew up, in the Catholic Church where we're constantly sinning and doing everything wrong and going to hell in a handcart. So there's not much hope for me. What are the benefits of being optimistic?
There are several, Roman. One is higher self-confidence and self-esteem. So there is a correlation between self-confidence, self-esteem, and for people who lack self-confidence and self-esteem, it tends to correlate often with depression. Or sort of a flat affect, if you will. So it is important for people to be mindful of that inner voice, whether or not you're hearing the coach or the critic. There's also people who are optimistic tend to achieve more, better performers. They make better leaders in sport, business, and politics. Confidence and optimism, they both are compelling. They pull you in. So there is this notion that you can influence people better with optimism. There's less illness, and when ill, faster recovery. And as Seligman points out in his book, optimism is the biggest predictor of health and wellness beyond the age of 45. People who are optimistic tend to experience fewer life traumas. They're more resilient. They cope better with anxiety. And then finally, they have more friends. There's just something about an optimist that pulls people in.
That's interesting.
Sometimes a pessimist. When you look at caller ID and there's a name there, and that's a person who typically is pessimistic, the energy is low, sometimes you don't even want to necessarily answer.
Yeah.
As opposed to a person who is going to infuse you with a lot of energy and fun and positivity. It just makes a big difference in one's overall quality of life.
2 minutes to 11. I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. Are there any downsides to being that perkly, bubbly little optimistic? Yuck.
There is, and that is what you pointed out earlier in terms of really honing in on being real. It is wonderful to be optimistic. Hope it infuses a positive energy. So we all can appreciate the fact that even facing into some of the biggest barriers and obstacles, it is important to infuse a positive energy. But you have to be real.
Okay.
In that sense of living in their world.
Like all the pessimists, hundreds of texts coming in on the text machine from all the pessimists saying, how do I change this? How do I become an optimist?
It really is important. You can do it. But it's a matter of heightened self-awareness, pushing into it a bit more, especially as a leader. Especially as a leader, when people are tired, fatigued, maybe a bit daunted by a task, it can make a huge difference in the positivity that a team feels pushing into a barrier. So if you're naturally pessimistic, don't worry about that. We need a blend of both. We need people who think in terms of possibility and probability, but
great advice.
Infuse energy.
Great advice, as always. It's Harold Hillman. He's a leadership coach, a managing director with the Sigmoid Curve Consulting Group. How do people find you?
I'm at www.sigmoidcurve.com.
Always a pleasure to catch up with you. Go and play the trumpet. Take up the piano while you can.
You know what? I will.
Oh, good on you.